I had the phone in my hand, and all of a sudden I heard this huge crack, and this giant flash of light came out of the phone and hit me in the face. It just threw me back like a rag doll. My mother-in-law starts screaming. I remember thinking, oh shit, I'm dead. I had lost all form. I was just a ball of energy. It was unbelievably powerful. A couple of weeks after that, I started having this insatiable desire to hear classical piano music. There's some part of my brain that is able to access a place where the music comes from. I don't know where it is, but it's in the fabric of the universe someplace.
I am here with Tony Cicoria. Tony is a semi-retired board-certified orthopedic surgeon with a BS in biology PhD from the Medical University of South Carolina and orthopedic training at University of Virginia. You have quite the credentials there, Tony.
Well, I have been poking around in the academics for a while.
Well, thank you so much for being willing to do this. Would you like to start sharing your story, anything leading up to your near-death experience that you feel is relevant?
Sure. I'll just start at the beginning of when that happened. Prior to the lightning, I was a practicing orthopedic surgeon, and I was involved in a lot of academic endeavors. I was involved with a big spine meeting every year. I was going down an academic orthopedic kind of life, and I was doing publishing and doing a lot of clinical work. And I was working, 12, 14 hours a day. And that was just my life at that point. And in 1994, in August, my wife's family had a communal birthday party because they had 4 or 5 people with birthdays all in August. So they would pick a place and have everybody come to it. So this year it was at Sleepy Hollow Lake in just below Albany, New York. We all showed up to have this big communal birthday party, about 25 people. And I was made in charge of the barbecue. And so I was outside running the barbecue. I wasn't paying attention to what was going on. We had rented a pavilion that was right next to the lake. And I had my back to the lake, so I wasn't aware of what was going on over the lake, because it started out as a beautiful day. And I just assumed it was going to continue to be so. But I didn't realize that there was a big thundercloud that had formed over the lake, and I was completely unaware of it. And I got somebody to cover me at the barbecue. I walked around to the front of the pavilion. There was a payphone attached, and I was going to call my mom to check on her because she wasn't going to be there. And I dialed her number. I let it ring 5 or 6, 7 times. She didn't pick up, so I was getting ready to hang up. And I had the phone in my hand, and I was just getting ready I started to pull it away from my face. And all of a sudden I heard this huge crack, and this giant flash of light came out of the phone and hit me in the face. And it just threw me back like a rag doll. And as I was going backwards, all of a sudden I had this really strange sensation of moving forward. And I remember standing there as utterly confused. And because I was aware of what had happened, I knew I'd been hit by lightning. And I saw it happen. And I knew I got thrown backwards. And I was absolutely confused because I was standing there. I'm at the bottom of the stairs. And I knew that I'd been going backwards, and what happened when I went forwards? It was a very subtle kind of a feeling, but it was very strange. And I looked at the phone, and it's dangling, and it's farther away from me than I had been. And right at that time, all of a sudden, my mother-in-law starts screaming, and she's at the top of the stairs, and she's running down the stairs screaming, and I'm thinking, this can't be good. When your mother-in-law is screaming at you, something bad's happening. But I noticed that she wasn't looking at me. She was looking off to her left. And as she came down the stairs, she came right in front of me, and like I wasn't even there. And I thought, what the hell is going on? And she took off to her left, and I thought, well, I better follow her because I don't know what's going on. And I took, I guess it must have been a few steps, and all of a sudden I'm confronted with myself on the ground. And I remember thinking in my usual vernacular, oh, shit, I'm dead. And it was just such a shock to me because I thought that if, when you died, there'd be something, bells and whistles or something would happen to let you know, but there was absolutely nothing. And I walked over to the body, and I noticed that there was a woman and her daughter who were standing behind me waiting for the phone. And the girl was about early teens, and her mom, they were together, and I guess the girl was going to make a phone call, and her mother was going to be there with her. And I saw the mom start to get down to do CPR. I started calling out to everybody and to let them know I'm here. Nobody could hear me and nobody could see me, but I could see and hear everything else. And I was kind of shocked, and I all of a sudden I realized that, geez, I'm thinking just like I normally would. I'm even thinking in the vernacular that I normally would. And at that point, I realized that whoever I am, I always am. And there's no such thing as death to the spirit. It just keeps on going. And at that point, I thought, okay, well, there's no point in standing here because nobody can hear me or see me. I'm going to go check on my family. So my wife and 3 kids are upstairs at this party. And I walk over to the stairs and I start to go up the stairs. And I get to about the 3rd step, and I suddenly realize that my legs are starting to dissolve. And I was a little freaked out. I'm like, what the hell is going on? And by the time I got up to the top of the stairs, I had lost all form. And I was just a ball of energy. And the stairs go off to the left. And I didn't bother to go with the stairs. I just went through the wall. And I came out right over my wife's head, who was on the other side of this wall. And she was sitting in the chair and she was painting children's faces. And I made a specific note mentally of, where the kids were and in what order and who was where, how the seating was arranged. And I didn't know that was going to be an important thing at the time, but later on it was. And I kept going through the room, and I had this epiphany that everybody would be fine, and that was my big concern. And I kept going. I passed through the room, and when I got through the roof was when things really got interesting. I felt like I had fallen into a river of pure positive energy. And there was a bright bluish white light that was streaming this radiant energy out from it. And it was unbelievably powerful. And there were only 2 sensations in it: absolute love and peace. And it was really amazingly powerful and encompassing. And I thought, my God, this must be the God energy. I looked at it and I could see the energy emanating from this source. And my science brain started to kick in and say, this is so powerful. You could measure this. And I'm like, okay. But, in retrospect, I'm thinking, I must have had a few screws loose at that moment. But the thing that I was really overcome with is that I could actually see this energy, and I could see that it had kind of a sine wave sort of a form. And what I was really struck by was that it actually made up everything. It flowed through everything and made up everything. And at that point, I realized that, okay, I'm actually seeing the way things really are. And I also realized that this river of positive energy was carrying me someplace. I could feel the direction and speed that I was moving. And I thought, I had no idea where I was going, but I was just ecstatic over how wonderful it was. And I saw a collage of pictures like on a wall of my life. And, just high points, low points. But it seemed unimportant. And nothing went into any depth with any of these pictures. It was just kind of oh, by the way, this was your life. And I just kept going, and I was really excited. And then right about the time I thought this is the greatest thing that could ever happen to somebody, it was like somebody flipped a switch. And bam, I was back in my body, and I was pissed. It was painful. Where this thing hit me in the face and where it came out my foot, I had burns, and they hurt. It felt like somebody stuck a hot poker in both those places. But I was still unconscious, and it seemed like it took another few minutes before I could actually open my eyes and say anything. And then, stupidly, when I was able to actually say something, I looked at the nurse who was kneeling next to me, and I said, "It's okay, I'm a doctor." And she just laughed and said, "You weren't a minute ago." And I'm realizing, okay, you're not thinking very clearly. Just keep your mouth shut and see what happens. And of course, they called the police and the ambulance. And I said, "No, I'm not going. I'm not going to go sit in the emergency room for hours and to have you tell me I'm still alive." I said, "Well, just got my family to just take me home. I would see my cardiologist, my neurologist friends, and just make sure everything was okay." So they did. And when I got home, I saw everybody, and everybody said the same thing. It's like, well, you're lucky to be here, and see what happens. So the one thing that I had real problems with in that first week was, and I was, thankfully I was supposed to be vacationing this week. So I was having trouble. I could look at you and know, I know you. Damn, if I could remember your name. It's like I knew that it was someplace in there, locked in a drawer, but I couldn't get to names. And I had trouble with diseases that I knew intimately. And, the names absolutely escaped me. So people and things, the names just weren't available. And that seemed to take about a week to go away. And then I was back to normal. And I thought, what the hell? What was the meaning of all of this? What I went through and what I experienced. And now I'm back to normal, and I'm confused. But I really wasn't back to normal because things had been changing. And at that point, so I went back to work, and it was a week or two before I was actually functioning back to normal again. And a couple of weeks after that, I started having this insatiable desire to hear classical piano music which was a big departure for me. I was a kid of the 60s and it was rock and roll. It wasn't much of anything else. But it just would not stop, this intense feeling. And I was so struck by it. I went to a store. I actually drove to Albany, New York, way back then. There weren't a lot of places that carried classical piano music. So I went to a store that carried it. And when I walked in, a CD seemed like it jumped off the wall into my hands. And it was Vladimir Ashkenazy playing his favorite Chopin. And I remember I took the CD and I started listening to it, and I could not stop. I listened to it all day long. I made everybody else listen to it at home and at work. I'm sure they were sick of it. And at that point, I realized that it's not going to be enough to listen to this music. I have to be able to play it, which was a big problem because I didn't have a piano. I didn't know how to play. And my mom had made me take piano lessons when I was 7 years old for a year, which I did under threat of life and limb. And at that point, I don't remember any of that. And I'd never had any desire to go back and play. But now I'm just being inundated by this desire to hear and play classical piano music. So the very next day that I had that epiphany, one of our babysitters came over and said, I have to move, and I have this old upright piano that I love. It was my father's. And could I store it at your house for a year till I get settled? And I'll send for it. And I said, sure. So now I have this intense feeling that I have to learn how to play a piano, and one suddenly appears. And so I'm thinking, okay, this is getting kind of weird. I just went with it. And I went to the store. I bought a book on how to teach yourself piano. And I started trying to do that. And I would get up early in the morning and I would spend a couple of hours trying to do the studies in this book. And within a few weeks of that, I have this incredible dream. And in the dream, I've just walked onto a stage and I'm looking way out on the front of the stage, and I'm out on the front of the stage playing a concert at this big concert hall, and I'm at this piano, and I'm thinking, what the hell am I doing? And it was like a dream, out of body experience in a dream. And as I'm walking across the stage toward myself, I realize that this is not somebody else's music. This is mine. And I was listening to it intensely, and the ends had a loud crashing ending, and it woke me up. And I woke up and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at the time, and it was 3:15 in the morning. And I said, the hell? And so I got up and I went out to that piano, and I was trying to plunk out some of the things that I'd heard, but I didn't know how to write anything, and I didn't know how to play it. So I said, to hell with this, I'll go back to bed. So I did, and I got up my usual hour and got ready to go to work. But from that moment on, whenever I sat down at the piano to try to teach myself, the music from the dream would start playing. And it was very insistent. It's almost like a little child. It's like if I ignored it for a day, it would be, Daddy, you gotta play with me. I'm like, okay. And as long as I played it or tried to work on it every day, it would leave me alone. If I didn't, it would become intrusive to the point that it would start playing when I didn't want it to. I was trying to work, or I was trying to do surgery, and the music is starting to play in my head. So I learned pretty quickly to pay attention to it on a regular basis. And I started trying to teach myself. And then I got the idea that I needed to get the sheet music for all of the things on the CD, which was magical thinking because that was so way ahead of me. I was undaunted by that, and I just kept at it. And I started to teach myself some of the music on the CD, and I was trying to teach myself a piece of music called the Fantasy Impromptu. It's a piece by Chopin, which is a complex piece, and it was very difficult for me. And I was trying to play the music, and I was having a lot of trouble because I couldn't get the hands to line up in the music, and I didn't understand why. And one day, my daughter's best friend Jackie was over at the house, and her mom came in to pick her up, and Penny Cypress was her name. And Penny walks in, she hears me banging on the piano, and she says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm trying to learn how to play this piece." I said, "But I don't understand why the hands don't line up." And she said, "They're not supposed to." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "That's what's called a polyrhythm." And I said, "What's a polyrhythm?" And she said, "I'm not even going to attempt to explain that to you." She was a classically trained musician. And she said, "You need to have a teacher." And she gave me the name of Sandy McCain, who was the chairman of music at Hartwick College, which is in the town that I lived in Oneonta, New York. I wrote to her, and I actually called her on the phone and explained to her what had happened and what I was experiencing, and would she take me on as a student. And so she asked me to bring 3 pieces over that I was trying to learn, and she had me play them, or what I could of them, and she said, "I'll take you on as a student under one condition. You do not try to play these again until I tell you you can." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "You're learning a lot of bad things on your own, and it's going to be much harder to undo that. So we need to start at the bottom, at the basics, and teach you the right way and build some structure." So that's what we did. And so we met 2 hours a week, every week. And that was kind of the way things were going to be. And I would get up at 5 o'clock, 4:30, 5 o'clock, and I would practice until 6:30 when I had to leave to go to work. And I would do my 12 hours of work. I came home, and I would have dinner if they hadn't eaten already. Then I would put the kids to bed, and then I was back at the piano till 12, 1 o'clock in the morning. And this went on every day. And, unfortunately, there was a price for that. I missed a lot of things with my kids. It didn't help my marriage, because my wife was neglected, and she felt like she'd been jilted for a piano. So I kept doing this piano, and I kept trying to write down bits and pieces of the music that was playing in my head, but I hadn't really tried to put it all together. I was progressing along in learning how to play, and I joined an organization called the Sonata, which was a piano camp for adults who were absolutely in love with the piano. And you could go there for a week, and you were locked in a room with the piano, and you played till you couldn't stand yourself. It was an incredible experience. And that was in 2002 that I started going to that. And each time you went, you were expected to play some piece that you've been working on all year. And it was a wonderful experience for me. In 2006, something strange had happened, and I had, after the lightning event in 1994, I was trying really hard to understand what happened to me, what it meant, and what I had experienced. And I had read every book that was available on people who'd been struck by lightning, and I had started to see a psychic medium shortly after the lightning, and because I wanted to know why and what was happening. So I would go a couple, 3 times a year, and it was time for me to go to see her in February of 2006. And when I went to her office, I walked in, and when I sat down, she says, "Tell me you're going to piano camp this year." And I said, well, I wasn't sure if I was going to go or not. She said, "You have to. There's somebody that's really important that you meet at piano camp this year." And I thought, okay. So I thought, well, I better sign up. So in 2000, I always went in May. Was the month I always went in, and they had a different camp each month. And so in May, when I went, the owner, Polly Vanderlind, and her sister Erica was the #1 salesperson at Steinway, New York City. She's also a classically trained musician and concert pianist. And she had left Steinway and went to Bosendorfer and another piano company, and she brought in 5 pianos for us to play on, which was part of a sales promotion. And I spent some time talking to her about all this crazy stuff that had happened to me and the music that was in my head. And we spent a number of hours talking about all this stuff. And at the end of that, she said, there's only one person that can tell this story, and that's Oliver Sachs. And I didn't know who Olver was at that time, other than the fact that he wrote the book Awakenings and was responsible for the treatment of Parkinson's disease. He was a famous neurologist, and he lived in New York City, and apparently she was friends with him. But I didn't think anything of it when she said it, other than it just seemed like a curiosity. But I no sooner got home, and the next month I get a phone call from Oliver Sachs. And Oliver said, "I heard about this crazy incident with the lightning, and I was wondering if you would come down to my studio in New York City, and I would like you to be one of my patients because I'm writing a book about people who've had interesting things like this and how it affected their brains." And I thought, sure. So in August of 2006, I went down to New York City, and I spent a full day with Oliver Sachs, which was one of the highlights of my life. What an incredible man, incredible mind. And we spent all day talking about the lightning and cases that he had. And at the end of the day, I was standing in the doorway saying goodnight to him, and he looked at me, and he had this piercing way of looking at people. And he said, that music from the dream went through an awful lot of trouble to get here. The least you can do is write it. And I thought, wow, coming from somebody like him, that was just a really very important moment for me. And when I left there, I went home, and it was about 3.5 hours to drive back, so I had a lot of time to think about it. And the next day, the first thing I did was I went and got a music CD program on how to write music. And it was like one of the books for dummies. Is How to Write Music for Dummies. And it was a great piece of work because I could play music into an electronic keyboard, and it would populate the screen, and I could play it. And if I had an internal control, of what the music was supposed to sound like. And just through trial and error, I could play something in it. And if it wasn't right, I knew right away. And so I went through this process. I spent 7 months writing the music, and my goal was to play the lightning piece for my piano camp in 2007. And so that's what I was planning to do. And when I got there in 2007, I played the piece for everybody, and it was well received. And while I was at the piano camp, Oliver called and said, I just wanted to ask your permission to use your story in my book. And I said, sure, I don't have anything to hide. And he said, well, good, because you're chapter 1 and it's coming out in the fall, but chapter 1 is going to be in the New Yorker magazine July 23rd. And I thought, oh, okay, I wasn't expecting that so quick. And sure enough, chapter 1 came out in the New Yorker magazine on July 23rd, and all hell broke loose. I started getting phone calls from all over the place. And one of the calls I got was from a friend of mine, Carlton Clay, who was the head of music department at the State University of New York in Oneonta, where I lived. And he says, I read this piece in the New Yorker, and I want you to come and teach a class. And I thought, well, that would be interesting. And said, sure. And a couple of weeks later, he calls back and says, gee, I'm getting an awful lot of calls about this. Would you consider playing the music for the class as well? And I said, sure. I don't think that's a problem. And, during this whole time, I'm still, continuing on with my studies. And about a month later, Carlton calls back again and he says, it's really getting kind of crazy with the amount of calls I'm getting about this music. And he said, would you consider doing a concert at the Performing Arts Center? And I said, no way. I said, I could never do that. I've never done that before. I said, that's way over my head. And somehow he talked me into it. And then I called my piano teacher and I said, Sandy, I said, I have no idea how to do this. I said, is there any way you can get me ready to do a concert in January? And she said, if you can give me 3 to 4 hours a day, we might make it. And this must have been October of 2007, and Oliver's book came out then. And I thought, okay. And so she did. We went to the Performing Arts Center, and she would teach me everything from walking onto the stage to walking off and introducing everything, the music and playing the music. And then she would make me play all of it and memorize every bit of it. And I went through this process, and about, I guess it must have been a few weeks, close to a month before a concert, which was going to be in January of 2008. And we picked that time because it was my birthday. And it's kind of a rebirth as I looked at it. And so the month before the concert, he calls me and says, I'm just sorry to do this to you. He said, but there are a number of people are interested from studios and they want to record this. And I thought, this is getting kind of crazy, but I guess why not? What's the difference? And by the time the concert came along, there were 3 television crews, the BBC One, Granada Media, and German Television. So, the entire front of the stage is just littered with cameras and lights. And I remember walking out onto the stage and thinking, I was just going to turn and run. There's no way I can do this. And I remember going to the green room before the concert, and I said to God and whoever was listening, I said, you've taken me through an awful lot of things and brought me here. Please don't abandon me and embarrass us both. And so I managed to get through the concert, and I actually had 3 pieces that I had written by that time, and I played them at the concert, and then things just kind of took on a life of their own. And I was asked to play at lots of different conferences and venues, a lot of which was associated with what's called the IANDS, International Association of Near-Death Studies. So I had played concerts for large groups that were associated with that conference, and even was a keynote speaker at the conference. I think it was in 2013. So it just really kind of continued on with that. And I've had, one of the things that was interesting is that whenever I played someplace, people would come up to me afterwards, and embarrassingly, they would get very quiet and close, and they'd say, "This something like this happened to me." And they were afraid to tell anybody because somebody was going to think they're crazy. And I did too. And this happened to me in the mid-90s, I didn't tell anybody except my closest friends, because back then it was a different time and mindset. And if you were a physician and you started talking about ghosts and near-death experiences, people would call the state and say, "You better take this guy's license away. He's a little loose around the edges." And so, until Olver's book came out, it was kind of like my secret in the closet, but he took it out and it became a household word. So that was gone. I couldn't hide behind anything any longer. And so it has continued on, and I have continued to talk to lots of people about it. And, in the hospital setting, I've been asked to, if somebody is dying from cancer or they've got some horrible problem, people have asked me to talk to them about what it's like on the other side. And it's been very rewarding from that standpoint.
Tony, thank you so much for sharing. What an incredible story. Do you have any thoughts on where this music came from? Did it come from the God energy that you experienced, or from a guide, or who was it that was wanting this music to come through so badly?
I don't know exactly where it comes from, but because I have continued to get the music, I've become a little more familiar with where it comes from. Mm-hmm. And there's some part of my brain that is able to access a place where the music comes from. I don't know where it is, but it's obviously in the fabric of the universe someplace, and my brain is able to receive it. Olver had an interesting thought about it. He said, "I think your brain's been rewired from the lightning, and you have access to areas of the brain that you didn't have before," and implied that there was some sort of genetic memory that I have in my genes of music. And, does that mean in a previous lifetime I was a musician or I was a pianist? It's certainly open to speculation. I've been through Akashic Records readings and I've been through age regression and I've been told that I had experience as a pianist before. And so there must be some memory of that. And when I would go to my piano camp, people were always amazed at the things that I was playing with the little amount of training that I had. And so that was always an interesting caveat to that. that I did have an aptitude I was totally unaware of prior to that. Since the lightning, I have continued to get music, and it comes almost as a download. And it's usually when I'm at the piano and I'm playing something, and I would sometimes just doodle at the piano, and all of a sudden the music would start. And I remembered I was playing some music. There was a piece that was done by Brahms, and as I started to play it, all of a sudden I started to hear it in symphony, and I thought, what the hell? And it felt like this entire symphony downloaded into my head all at once. And this happened with a number of pieces of music. Two of the pieces, when the first concert, there were 3 pieces of music that I played, and they all came to me in the same way. The one from the dream, but then 2 of the others came when I was playing at the piano and playing, and all of a sudden this intense music would come in, and it was just absolutely possessing. I couldn't do anything else. And that's the way it's been. Now I actually have to relax and open to it, or maybe that's a good way that it's come about. And I can start to hear where the music comes from. Does it come from heaven? Whatever heaven is, I think that somehow, again, my brain can access information that's stored in the fabric of the universe. In all the reading that I've done, I've come to realize that our brains are not generators of all of this information. We're receivers. Our brain is a receiver, and if you look at some of the greatest things that have come out of people's ideas, they always say that, well, this came to me. It wasn't something I generated. It came to me from some place or some time. And Tesla was one of the ones that always said stuff like that. I've read books where the conversations with the great composers, and they all say the same thing. Mozart said, comes from heaven. It comes to me in a finished form, and all I do is write it down. And he was a big proponent of that. But the other guys also said the same thing. Beethoven, somebody criticized the fact that he wrote something the way that he did. And he said, that's the way it was given to me. I'm not changing it. And Brahms was another one. He said he had a muse. Whatever a muse was, the music would be fed to him by another source. And even today, modern composers say the same thing. It's that they are able to tie into some place where all this music exists. And from her firsthand experience, I understand that.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I was going to bring up some of the composers like you mentioned, like Beethoven. Was he the one who was deaf and still composed?
He was deaf. Yeah.
Yeah.
He had lead poisoning. And there's a really interesting book called Beethoven's Hair. And there was a custom back then. When you were dying, you would call your closest friends together, and they would cut off some of your hair and save it as a memento. Somebody actually made it out of Germany with a sample of that during the Holocaust. And they had contacted some people to find out, if there was anything that they could learn from the hair. And they found out that he had lead poisoning from his cup.
Wow.
And he he had an absolute horrid life. He was sick all the time. There's one of the problems with lead poisoning is you develop liver disease and ascites, which is fluid in the abdomen. You would get this big abdomen and would have difficulty breathing. And they had a doctor that would come over and he would stick a wooden straw into his belly and let the fluid drain out. And of course, he would get infected and he would be sick as a dog. And then he lost his hearing, and the only way he could compose was to put his head against the piano, and the vibration, he could interpret as frequencies and sounds. And, that was an incredible feat for somebody, for anybody. And, the fact that he was able to compose music like that when he was as sick as he was and miserable as he was, it's really incredible.
Absolutely. Do you think that there's some significance to this music? Because I hear you when you're describing, at least in the beginning when you first started hearing it, that it was this almost like overwhelming thing that you had to learn to play and you had to bring it through. Do you think there's a reason for that? Do you think that it's significant for us in some way at this time?
I do. I really have come to believe that there's something in the music that I don't understand and that other people don't understand but can feel. And one of the things that's happened is I've had a lot of people that have even come to the point where they asked if they could come to my house and lie down on the floor under the piano to feel the vibration. And I've had a lot of people come up after the concerts and say, I had visions, or I'm, hearing things. So there's something in the music that stimulates part of the brain, and I don't understand what it all means, but I think that there's something important in the frequencies of the music, and it has to do with healing. And it has to do with evolution of consciousness. And I think that it's just part of some greater things that we don't have any idea about.
Tony, thank you so much for doing this interview. One final question. Is there somewhere that people could go to listen to some of your music or to hear that original piece?
It's available on CD. I think you can get it from almost any of the music stores online. It can be downloaded. It was published through cdbaby.com, but it's also I've seen it on Amazon and almost all of the other big music vendors. It's also on YouTube. I played a concert in Vienna at Mozart's home. And in Mozart's home, he has a basement performance studio, which is pretty cool, just to be in the house with somebody like that. And I got to play the music, and it was put on YouTube. I think that was in 2013. So it's available in a number of different ways to listen to it.
Wonderful. I'll put a couple links in the description for people so they can find that. Does that original piece that you heard when you came back from your near-death experience, does that have a name, or is there any way people could look that up?
Yeah, it's just the technical name of it is Fantasy Opus 1 and subtitled The Lightning Sonata.
Perfect.
And the reason I did it like that was when I played it at my music camp, I had just introduced it as the Lightning Sonata. And the lady who was in charge of the camp, who was also a concert pianist and, very thoroughly trained, came up to me afterward and she said, you can't actually call it a sonata. because it doesn't have a sonata form. She said it's actually a fantasy in form, and that's what you have to call it. And I said, fine. I said, is there any restriction on subtitles? And she said, no. I said, fine. So it'll be Fantasy Opus 1, The Lightning Sonata, which is what I finally settled on.
I love it. Well, Tony, thank you so much for being willing to share your story. And thank you also for being the vessel for this music to come through and doing such an important job for the rest of us as we go through this spiritual evolution.
No, absolutely. You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for watching the Love Covered Life podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and comment with your thoughts and opinions, and check the description box for the links to my free community where I share lots of resources, my Pay What You Can community where we do classes and challenges together, my TikTok, Instagram, my Clips channel, and lovecoveredlife.com where I share my paintings. Thank you so much for your support.